Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Bob Sewell. I'm president of the Houston Archaeological Society, and welcome to our April 2025 monthly meeting. This evening, we welcome as our speaker, Alexandra Younger, who is a senior archaeologist at Integrated Environmental Solutions, LLC, a cultural resources firm in Denton, Texas. Following graduation from Appalachian State University, she began her career as an archaeologist in Williamsburg, Virginia. She moved to Texas 10 years ago and has since earned a Master of Science degree in Geography from the University of North Texas. Her professional experience spans the northern, eastern, and central Texas areas and includes archaic, prehistoric, and historic age sites, stone tool analysis, geoarchaeology, remote sensing, databasing, historic archaeology, and cultural resource management are among her repertoire of applications in archaeology. As the current president of the North Texas Archaeological Society, much of her personal time is dedicated to outreach and public archaeology. Alexandra will be discussing the recent excavations this evening at Washington-on-the-Brazos State Historic Site, where she serves as the principal investigator. 6-year renovation of the museum and associated buildings on the site began in late 2023. Also known as the birthplace of Texas, the town is best known as the site of the Convention of 1836 and the signing of the Texas Declaration of Independence from Mexico. So a very historic site. Please welcome Alexandra Younger.
Thank you for the intro, Bob, very much. Hopefully everyone hears me well, loud and clear, in room and on Zoom. Thank you guys for inviting me down to Houston. I do actually spend some personal time down here because I do have family here in Katy, so any excuse to come down and talk is a good excuse, but it's been lovely getting to know the Houston Society, coming from the North Texas Archaeology Society, so this has been just a lovely pleasure. So thank you for hosting me. So today I'm going to discuss with you guys our recent excavations at Washington-on-the-Brazos State Historic Site, also known as the birthplace of Texas. Because of its association with important events during this period in Texas history, the Texas Historical Commission, or the THC as we refer to them, planned to reconstruct the early to mid 19th century buildings related to the events and major players at that park at that time, all related to the Texas independence. My team and I began excavations in the fall of 23. We had initially completed those excavations in the early winter of 24, but we did actually go back this winter for a couple of months to just wrap up a few things that were of interest. So today I'm going to just kind of summarize some of our findings. I'll initially start with quite a bit of historic context because a lot of that plays into how we conducted our archaeology. So the site is also a park with a museum, a visitor center. It even has a real historic age plantation site where they already conduct a lot of living history kind of activities. The plantation that's been actually brought onto their property from nearby, but it is time period specific. Really, if you go to that park today, it's just those few things plus a replica of the House of Independence. So none of the original structures are part of that park anymore. It's located on the west bank of the Brazos River. It's just south, right where the confluence of the Navasota and the Brazos rivers meet. The main artery of the site exists as a trail today. You see it on the left-hand side of the screen going from the Brazos River towards the FM road. That is the original ferry street, which I'll get into that in a minute. It spans the floodplain and the terrace. And east, to the east of what would have been the town center and now the visitor center, the museum, and Barrington Plantation. The replica of the House of Independence is located right here where it actually once was. So, like I said, none of the original town buildings are there today, but that was kind of part of our investigation, is to find these things. So excavations couldn't commence without consultation with a historian, somebody who could conduct a deep dive into the archival. And Michael Moore served that role for us. And Michael Moore actually served that role for San Felipe, if any of you have actually been there. So being so close by of the same period, it only made sense that he was a consultant on this. Their town also reflects with newly built construction reflecting the architecture of the time. So it too is a living history museum, more reflective of Austin's role in the revolution. So it commemorates him during in 1823, where his headquarters was located. Austin didn't survive. San Felipe de Austin didn't survive the war. It was actually burned down by its own residents. So you guys heard of the runaway scrape, right? That time period where a lot of panic was ensuing because of losses against the Spanish royalists, and the Alamo were creating a lot of havoc at the time. Michael, in his deed records, looking at deed records at both towns, noticed a very big difference between San Felipe de Austin and Washington-on-the-Brazos. And you'll just see these records kind of get more and more complicated. Here's San Felipe de Austin. This is the reconstruction that you would see today if you were to go to the park. Here's me, Michael, and Dr. Sarah Chesney on one of my visits to the park. Okay, so okay, so one of those complications, so we know where Washington-on-the-Brazos is located, right? But none of the original plat maps exist anymore. We know that it was located on the Brazos River, but a lot of what we understand is from, Richard Caslin's book and really Michael Moore's deep dive into the archival of what really was left. Washington was not just situated on a major river, it was situated on a major crossing, which was historically a road utilized by the Spanish when they were moving in between their missions between East Texas and all the way down to Goliad. So presumably this was not just a trail forged by the Spanish, but really by Native Americans. La Bahia is not just historic, but it's a prehistoric trail. Austin's colonists arrived in 1821. A series of filibusters in the early 19th century occurred in the area. There was lots of fighting with the Spanish royalists, and an economy at some point was growing by 1830, eventually with the completion of a ferry crossing. Lots of settlements were accumulating at this time up and down the Brazos River. But ultimately, here we go, here's some of the relationships. The burning of San Felipe, and ultimately the Texas independence. So following the Texas independence was the annexation from 1845 to 1846, which reshaped the landscape. There was a higher emphasis on agriculture, a boom in cotton production, and the implementation of steamboats at this point. So the economy was boosting because they were utilizing the river more. And at that point, Washington-on-the-Brazos was the northernmost point that you could reach geographically by boat. In addition, we had an addition of newer frame and brick stores. Cedar was a very popular kind of building tool. These are things that we're looking for in the archaeological record. So actually, I kind of want to go into some of that a little bit. So our goal at Washington-on-the-Brazos as archaeologists was not just to find the domestic debris, but really try to locate these foundations and the architectural debris. And there was, Michael identified sort of a series of changes in the architecture over these very short periods of time, right? So very early Washington, right? It was just owned by a very small family that owned a few tracts, and one of them decided we're going to start the Washington Company and start building a town. And so that town really, they knocked down some trees, and all they had initially were some pole cabins and some frame houses, and the frame houses would have just been probably the tavern and the hotel, right? Everything else were just like very temporary dwellings during the Revolutionary period. They would have been extracting the wood primarily from, I think, from the bottomlands, right? So you got oak, hickory, a variety of hardwood trees that were hand hewn. And then into the Republic era, you start to see the introduction of stone and brick masonry, dog trot log buildings. So your log cabins were a little bit more elevated. They became a little bit more sophisticated. But frame buildings a little bit more frequent. What we do know what's indicated by some of what Michael had done research on was that a lot of the brick construction didn't come till later. We were still using a lot of wood and stone. So this came into play with our interpretations of what we were finding in terms of foundations, right? Statehood, more framing timber. Now you have the introduction of sawmills. Nobody stopped hand hewing anything, but you had this kind of like increase in these facilities. And frame buildings existed. They were just getting a little more sophisticated, a little bit fancier, if you will. And then the town really became blanketed in a lot of brick. Remember, this is a time of economic explosion, lots of economy coming in and out. And then over time, the town of Washington kind of receded, right? So what they didn't subscribe to after the economic boom, after the annexation, was the railroads. And the railroad really was the death knell of Washington post-annexation. So the neighboring Navasota and Brenham started to flourish. And then Washington ultimately, by the late 19th century, was reduced to farmsteads. And then if that's not enough whiplash for you, there was a fire in 1852 that burned most of it down. But they did rebuild for some of it. But that made the archaeology more challenging too, which is something that San Felipe, for other reasons, it burned down. They had challenges archaeologically reconstructing some of that town. So this is what the park looked like after the 1920s. It was acquired by the state, kind of at the turn of the century. They started acquiring pieces of land. Now you can see in this image an amphitheater, a residence. The park superintendent would have lived on the site. There is a portion of it that was private. So to the bottom right of your screen, which is the western portion of the property, Steg Molars. Okay, so earliest investigations were conducted, a lot of them were in the 1960s, and there were a few done by TPWD and A&M, but like the primary investigations started with E. Mott Davis and James Corbin, and their goal was to, surprise, surprise, look for the Hall of Independence. So those were kind of primary investigations. And then in the later 60s, about 1969, Desime Lorraine and Marsha Jackson continued kind of from their work. And what they did primarily was put a lot of trenches in. And so archaeologically, if you're not too worried about how much destruction you're going to do, trenches make a lot of sense if you want to cover a wide amount of space in like a very linear fashion, right? Because if you just keep digging one continuous hole, you're going to encounter some stuff. And they knew enough about the layout of the town that they would probably encounter some foundations or street corners or sidewalks, and they did just that. So you see a lot of trenches, continuous or discontinuous trenches being excavated throughout the town. And intelligently, Decime and Marcia knew to kind of build off of what Corbin and E. Mott Davis did. And Corbin and Mott Davis didn't really find that much. They were actually pretty disappointed with some of their results. But what we got out of Jackson Lorraine was we found some streets. We figured out the layout of the town, which was already pretty well assumed. And then some foundations. So they did those trenches and they did excavations off of those trenches. And they were really the foundation of what our investigation built off of, was Lorraine and Jackson and some of their really cool aerial photos. And here's just some examples of the extent of their investigations. So there were other investigations later on. Texas A&M had come in. Obviously, some investigations had to be conducted for the visitor center and the museum, things like that. And then down on the floodplain, there was some work done. But nothing that we could really utilize in our investigations, aside from some more emphasis on the prehistoric, right? Because again, you know, we're on a terrace, we're close to a river. You're gonna find prehistoric campsites and occupations. So that was definitely part of our palimpsest. Okay, so like I said, there's no original plat map of the town. A lot of this was derived from disparate information. Michael had already discovered that much of the archival information had burned down or flooded out in courthouses. Like, a lot of these records just don't always survive. And so exhaustive research has been done to try and find every map and every piece of information related to Texas independence. And so somebody from 1970s, he developed a map based on some archival, and actually this map is pretty good representation of not just what was where in the town, but kind of its layout. So we also used this as one of our kind of anchors, right, to georeference what we were doing. And Michael really helped us do that. So ultimately, we came up in coordination with THC, a few buildings of interest because of the time period and what occurred there. So we ended up with what we called priority areas, and the priority areas were just kind of reflective of where possibly these buildings of interest would have been. They included a tavern, they included a blacksmith, a personal dwelling. Sam Houston's office was of interest. All things related to the 7th Congress and you know, conversations that were going on at the time. Everything surrounding the Hall of Independence, right? All that context. So we set out to do a carpenter, the original carpenter, all kinds of buildings. And so the logical thing to do before you break ground is to consult with a remote sensing specialist who specializes in ground penetrating radar, magnetometer, and electromagnetic resistivity. And Christopher Goodmaster happens to work for Integrated Environmental Solutions. So before I came out and did my investigations, he conducted all of those investigations in the same priority areas as myself. So what he found was what we expected, because remember, this became a park in the 20th century. There was new construction, new roads, new buildings. There were farmsteads already previously constructed. He found a lot of noise, a lot of historic overprinting. So when we set out with this idea that the remote sensing would inform where we dig, it was a little more complicated, but it did ultimately work out for us. So in some cases, very complicated, very imprinted on. In some cases, a little bit more clear, where we could actually direct some of our investigations. And this stuff will come up again. Okay, so let's get into the investigations. Let's do away with the cultural context. So our first priority was Hatfield's Exchange, and Hatfield's Exchange was quote unquote a grocery store. And then I quickly learned that there was a lot of terminology out there, grocery, grog shop, coffee shop, that all sort of danced around the topic that they were really just bars. So this was Hatfield's Exchange really served primarily as a saloon. It was 2 stories. It was a frame building. This is a location that the 7th Congress met. And it's rumored that they actually constructed an exterior stairwell so that the members of Congress, when they would come to meet, that they wouldn't, pop downstairs for a tipple. One of those scenarios. Very cool building. It also consequently burned down in 1852 during the fire. But a lot of great things happened at Hatfield's Exchange. Not just the Congress met, but really important topics were debated, not just during the Revolutionary period, but also leading up to annexation. And annexation was a very big topic debated at this location, which is kind of why we were looking for it. In terms of foundation, pretty much negligible. Finding any foundation related to Hatfields was ephemeral. But what we did find in lieu was a ton of artifacts, and they were 19th century artifacts, and they all related to kind of activities that were going on there. We did find, some brick alignments that we couldn't make sense of. We weren't going to just try and interpret what they meant. But this was kind of the end product. It's a little funky for an aerial view because there were actually a lot of trees on this part of the property, and it made it a little hard to take it. But this was the extent of our investigations. And what you'll also notice, how red it is. And that red, what is really indicating is that the subsoil, the clay, is very close to the surface. There wasn't a lot of very good melanized organic soil horizon on top of that. It was kind of on a slope. It was on the previous Stegmuller property, and right next to it was this big, deep gully. So that accounts for why we did have archaeological deposits, we just didn't have structure. And so being an unstable kind of landform, you don't have very good preservation. And actually, it kind of showed up pretty well in Christopher's data as well. So on the right side of the screen, which is north, grid north, is where our archaeological deposits were strongest. And that's where the kind of those deep shadows start showing. So we had a deposit, we just didn't have foundation. But what we also noticed, that kind of horseshoe shape, a little bit of a horseshoe shape. And we're like, really odd, something would cause that. Here's the location from land. You can't really see, but it dramatically drops off through here. There's a gully. And then we noticed when looking at the aerial photography, the historic areas, that there was a lot of like plowing and dirt moving to kind of prevent some of this erosion from happening. So the private landowners were really trying to manage the erosion themselves. And those scars are reflected in the geophysical data. So, we still found some very interesting stuff, just not a ton of foundational, right? The artifacts really told the story here. Not only that, but these 19th century artifacts were heavily thermally altered. So that was another indicator that there wasn't just a fire, there was a strong fire. Some of those artifacts, like the ceramics, should not have boiled and burned the way they did, but it had to have been a very hot fire for them to do so. What we did find in terms, we were hoping were foundations, were just more kind of weird brick collections. So the other feature here on the right-hand side of the screen was very close to what would have been the old fence line, the Stegmuller property. I think somebody was just chucking up, plowed up, handmade brick and just putting it back towards the fence line. So none of this was like really in situ. But when you think you're coming across something really critical when it looks like architectural debris, but it could just be more refuse that's been pushed around the landscape. So part of this historic overprinting kind of had to do with really the early 20th century and late 19th century use of it. not really so much at the town site. And underneath this brick was, barbed wire. So we kind of knew. And then we had a similar problem. The second location that was of high priority would have been the tavern. And Hollenlott's Tavern, as you were coming from the ferry crossing, up the hill, up the terrace, would have been the first building on your left, right? Inviting you into the town. They had lodgings. And so this was a critical building of interest. Davy Crockett once stayed here, but it too had a lot of complicated history related to the park history. So remember when I showed you those really complicated images produced by our geophysicist? We've got what you see are three linear anomalies extending through our excavation area, and those are water lines. Those are 20th century water lines. So again, we have to start thinking other ways to approach the excavations because we just don't have the remote sensing to aid us. So we started in consultation with the historian where we thought we should. We started uncovering this really weird material. It was kind of looked like cement. Some of it was dressed stone. Some of it was handmade brick. We're like, we're onto something. This is exciting. And then the more we uncovered, we're like, this can't be like 19th century. There's literal cement in here. So we've got, some dressed stone. It has a very specific dimension. We even profiled it and it has a water line going through it. And so this park superintendent, Jonathan Failer, dug up some of the TPWD documents. I forget what it was. It was like I think it had to do with the park development. And it was listing out some of the facilities. And so we knew in this vicinity, we knew where every building related to the residence was. The park superintendent lived here. There was a barn. There was a water tower, but he found this photo of where the water tower was starting to get removed and this outbuilding that we couldn't account for. And we found through the records that it was just like a volatiles building where somebody was storing like gasoline and things like that. But it doesn't show up here. Here's the park residence. Our excavations would have been just behind this tree. So it wasn't a part of these other outbuildings. It was this whole complicated mess. So, okay, we uncovered that mystery, but like, where is the tavern? And so we started excavating a little bit north, and lo and behold, handmade brick and articulated handmade brick. So we're very excited about this. So what we were seeing at this point, what you're seeing on the screen, is either a corner foundation or a Rumsfeld fireplace, and quickly became known as a Rumsfeld fireplace foundation. What we knew about the tavern was that it was 20 by 40 feet. And some of this is speculative. We're basing it off of, yes, primary resources, but a lot of these primary resources were people's like written accounts to family members in a letter, right? Oh, I came up this road and this building looked to be about 20 by 40 feet. So we didn't always have records to go by. And a lot of that just had to do with things just not getting filed appropriately during the Revolutionary era. So that's not that unusual. But we knew from some of those accounts that on either end, 40 feet apart, would have been a fireplace on either end of the building, which was, the tavern. It was a lodging. It was a place for the public to go. So obviously, we would want to look 40 feet in the opposite direction of the Rumsfeld. And we didn't find anything, but we found like some artifacts and some stains. So we started chasing those, and not really that in line with it. We found another foundation. This time it's not brick. It's limestone. It's local. We've got a local stone foundation. Figuring out precisely what it was a little difficult because it does seem to form a shape, but it's collapsing on itself, right? But we did talk to some experts from THC, and one or two of them felt, this is reminiscent of a fireplace foundation. And then there were a lot of very interesting artifacts that found their way into this deposit. And one of them was this really interesting liquor bottle that we had to kind of look up. It was an olive flask. And it was in fragments, but it has an illustration of a horse-drawn carriage over kind of the early days of the railroad, right? Before you had your steam engines. And as far as we can, it says success to the railroad. So here's a little bit of success right here. As far as we can tell, it dates to 1831, which would support the earliest construction of the tavern. The tavern, remember, was it was Revolution era. It was one of the first buildings constructed in addition to all the cabins. So we chose at that point to excavate a portion of here. This is from a museum online that actually had like the real illustration made out for us. So we did excavate a portion of it in coordination with THC just to see like, does it have kind of a vertical distribution? Can we see some structure to it? And it didn't really have much more going on. It did have kind of this trench that we excavated as a separate feature, probably a builder's trench. We're not really sure. It was also very full of interesting 19th century refuse. But so, yeah, let's talk about some of that. Some of the notable finds were coins. And this one was a Spanish coin dating to 1820, depicting King Ferdinand. We have more indications that at least this one feature that's part of what we think is the tavern is very early Washington. So King Ferdinand VII of Spain. Also on one side would have been his bust, and the other side would have been the coat of arms. Here we have a gold-plated pocket watch key on the left, and remarkable quality. Also, an 1831 dime, nearly no tarnishing, remarkably in very good shape. And I think we even had a 1925 penny just to kind of round out the temporal record of Hatfield. But like I said, it was a palimpsest. We didn't have these like wonderful layers of like, 20th century, 19th century. It was all kind of mixed in. So, we had to do quite a bit of interpreting. This also beautiful piece is a Bennington style porcelain doorknob. It is diagnostic, but not as much as we'd like. It could have been made in the mid 19th century. It also could have been made in the early 20th. So this was just a popular kind of doorknob. So it could have been park residence, but it also could have been part of the tavern. We're not really sure. Let's see. We also found one of a very few kaolinite clay pipes. This one had probably the most decoration on it. Typically these are an English-inspired design, but very common at the time. Kaolinite was everywhere when I dug sites near Williamsburg, Virginia. It's just very popular. But this is still a beautiful piece that you'll probably see in the museum. This one's my But in that was also the letter D, and that was kind of the giveaway of what it represented. And through our research, we found out that it was an 1837 Republic of Texas Dragoons uniform button. So again, we've got this just from that one feature. A lot of this came out either next to it or inside of it. All of this very early time period. Washington-on-the-Brazos artifacts. So that one was definitely my favorite, I think. One of the last things we found when we excavated north of the foundation was another brick foundation. And it was just really a confirmation that we were no longer at the tavern. We were now in a neighboring property. This had been encountered by Decimé Lorraine and Marcia Jackson previously. They thought it might be part of a horse stable. Through some of our research, what we found out that this kind of brick rubble floor wasn't fully articulated bricks. They were just repurposed. They were handmade. They were of the period. we figured out what they had mapped out dimension-wise. This is what they encountered, but it would have been 6 foundations, brick piers, and then this rubble floor. And it probably pertained to the exterior of a building where there was a shed covering and they were storing stuff. We've seen it in some plantation literature referred to as mud steps. So it's just kind of an interesting little side quest we had, but not really part of our scope. But here is again their sketch of the 6 brick piers, and then instead of mapping in every brick, kind of at the bottom portion of the page was the brick floor. We measured it out. It's exactly the same one that they'd encountered. So jury's out what it was about. But there was a lot of these buildings either had changes of use over time. They were different kinds of businesses. So in the vicinity of Holland Lot Tavern, what we were encountering, we encountered evidence of the print shop. We encountered evidence of the nearby stables. Things we knew were in the vicinity, we just weren't sure where they were or what they were a part of. Lots of print type. In fact, if you go to San Felipe today, they've got an old-fashioned printer there that was designed in Germany. That's authentically designed, but modern day. So some of our lower priority excavations, so we didn't get to put as many units in some of these places. One of them was Houston's office. And what we know about Houston's office, obviously it wasn't his initially, it belonged to a different lawyer. I don't have his name. McFarland. Yeah, so he was there, not McFarland, but Washington was there between 1842 and 44. McFarland's office was just this little modest 16 by 16 foot log cabin. Would have had a fireplace, would have had windows, maybe shutters, and a doorway. So Houston was not at this point a man of luxury at all. So we targeted our excavations over some of the geophysical anomalies that they were very subtle, but enough to go off of. And what we ended up encountering was what we think is a post mold. And post molds in archaeology don't tend to be this big. They tend to be a lot smaller. Those of you who've worked in East Texas and encountered a Caddo House post mold kind of generally know the morphology of these things, but this was what I had come to learn was in the construction of a cabin would have been more of a stump-sized post. So this is what they refer to as stump molds. This one was about 17 inches in diameter. So we kind of left it in profile, and that's how it kind of looks in profile. And then 4 meters from that, and I forget which cardinal direction, I think west, we found another one of similar morphology. So we're pretty confident we bumped into Houston's office. It just was a matter of, we couldn't really put in as much investigation as we would like. But here's the distribution of the 2 soil stains, right? Generally extending north to south, I believe. Some of the notable finds there was a lot of overprinting there as well for reasons, agricultural. But we found some interesting domestic artifacts, a lot of mocha ware, which is indicative of the 19th century, a lot of degraded material. But here we've got some kind of really oddball. We had an Indian head penny from 1890 and what we're pretty sure is a toy soldier. So those were kind of the most notable artifacts. But if I were to recommend more work for future investigations, it would absolutely be Houston's office. More of a segue, not a very big primary concern because we were focusing on structures that pertained to independence. We did kind of want to see what was a day in the life like for a family. So we wanted to do something more personal. Or at least folks, or Michael Moore really did. So this was the Bethel Morris dwelling. It's right next to actually the Hall of Independence. It was an 1835 dwelling. It just would have been a very modest cabin, right? So I think at one point a bachelor lived there. It used to be a tailor shop. It also used to be a gun shop. So this dwelling had a very uh, mixed history, but ultimately it became somebody's. And so we were looking for evidence of it. We didn't really have a lot to go by. We didn't get to conduct remote sensing through there, so we didn't do any magnetometer survey. We had very little to go off of, so we just kind of put this string of units, sort of like a trench. Yeah, so we didn't find foundations again, but what we did find was lots of awesome trash. And so we were very excited about that because trash pits really offer like a really cool glimpse, a window into what was going on at the time. So we had these big, fat, intersecting trash units. Most visible artifacts you can even see here, the brick and mortar. So yeah, obviously, architectural debris that was getting thrown out was a part of it. But we saw evidence of food consumption and dining and other activities going on. Here's a really nice profile of one of those trash bins. Our most prominent artifact were butchered fragments of faunal remains, largely pig and bovine. In addition, we had evidence of the tailor shop, which was reflected in buttons, right? Clothing items, and accessories. We had smoking pipes. We had a lice comb that was made completely out of bone. That was probably the biggest shocker. Like, what the heck is this comb for? It's so bizarre. Smoking pipes and a really cool, this is a late 18th to early 19th century trigger guard that was probably related to the gunsmith shop that was there at the time. So we have just kind of this like mix of activities going on in the town. In addition, we covered this blue transferware plate from it was the Eton College design from 1852 to 56 with the pastoral design. And our goal wasn't to mine trash pits, so we quickly had to move on from this stuff. But one of the most stunning and ubiquitous artifact types to Washington in this period were a group of ceramics referred to as dipped earthenware. And I'm only sharing the website here from Maryland because we didn't really have any good whole specimens. If you go to the museum, they sell some replicas. But this was so common in our assemblages. And they often refer to them blanketly as mocha-ware, but it turns out that there's a lot of different subcategories within these dipped earthenware types. And most of them were represented at Washington, and they're absolutely just like stunning and unique and something very worth looking into. Just something I just wanted to bring up that you'll see at the museum when you go. Our pièce de résistance, and this is what we came back to keep working on this year, were the Hurd's brick buildings. So we initially employed 98 1-by-1 meter units across this building complex. And then we uncovered all these different feature types. So there were 3 buildings here, maybe 1 frame, constructed in the 1850s, very big, like 22 by 25 feet in one direction. Lorraine and Jackson did expose some of it. We just kind of continued across what they had already done. There would have been, okay, so this is some of what they had uncovered. So they uncovered some brick foundations and corners, and the Park Road, unfortunately, was extending through there at the time. So we rotated it to be more north. So we concentrated, kind of worked from here out. And you'll see we kind of expanded across this. Ooh, excuse me. And then Christopher, in his great utility, not just as our geophysics specialist, also mosaicked some of their cherry picker photos together so we could really see what they excavated and how and where. And even though these fences were no longer extant, neither was the road, his geophysics actually picked up some of these posts. And so we were able to kind of target units exactly where we needed to target them. So this drone image captures kind of beautifully the extent of the excavations as of 2 years ago. We did more work kind of on the north and east side and exposed more of this wall and some other things. But what you're seeing here are multiple phases of construction. So Hers brick buildings mostly were largely mercantile, but obviously probably had their own different uses and phases over time. Also was part of some of the congressional meetings that went on. But here you have good gracious, a wall foundation here. You have a mysterious linear brick foundation, brick rubble floor. Remember we talked about the mud steps. Some of the wall fall that just sort of collected in these locations. And then what we were pretty sure was refuse from Jackson and Lorraine from when they were excavating here previously and redepositing. But here you can see this wall foundation extends south. So presumably it kind of rearticulates here. So here's some of just examples of the linear brick. And then on top of that would have been that road. Here's some of the asphalt that Jackson Lorraine, uncovered or had to deal with initially when they were taking that wall back. So even though it was kind of grown over, we had sort of recovered a little bit of that. So you just got this kind of cool layer cake effect going on with the park construction from the early 20th century. The brick rubble floor, we can't lend a whole lot of speculation to, but nonetheless, it was interesting that it was kind of part of the construction, either an exterior or temporary kind of structure. Here you have the fence posts that I discussed earlier that were 20th century. Those pertain to this this fence right here. So the cement posts were still, and actually one of them, they actually planted them perfectly down the center of the Herd brick building foundation. And this is just kind of how it progressed for us. So it was a little bit difficult to maintain the unit excavation because ultimately the weather got the best of us. So we could have kept going. We could have exposed all these buildings. And I know the park and the THC very much wanted to see that happen. But, you know, exposure can turn into something very terrible over periods of time. But part of their goal now, seeing all this, was that maybe we should incorporate for once archaeology as an exhibit. So one of the plans is now pretty much set in stone, so to speak, that they're going to reconstruct Rutgers drug building over it, right, which used to be there, but keep it as an exposed archaeological exhibit. The bricks as they are articulated in the ground, protected, but for us to view, kind of like you see a lot over in Europe. So this ultimately will become part of the exhibit. And some of the cute things we discovered while excavating it was a 19th century kitty cat paw print. So if you look close enough, the park superintendent will show you if you come visit. So ask him about the paw print. He will definitely point it out to you. But it just goes to show that these bricks, you know, they just sat out and dried out, you know, for periods of time. There was a survey conducted by TPWD. I don't remember what year, you know, I think it was the 90s, to try to find this brick kiln, like where were they manufacturing them? And they're very much in the town. They found evidence of the brick drying platforms closer to the river. But as far as how old the kiln is, still a mystery. So we don't know the precise date of when the brick kiln was erected and when they started implementing brick manufacture. So even despite all of the investigations that we did and other groups did, I'll leave it there if you want a picture of the kitty print. There's still a lot of big questions about what was done when, right? But we still kind of have a general idea of the phases of construction, but then you get these more kind of subtle phases of construction that need a little bit more sussing out, or you can't really isolate. But again, we've got our floor in yellow. We have mystery brick alignments in orange that maybe they had to do with the pre-construction, right? Maybe they just assisted in the you know, the moving and pivoting of walls and objects, or maybe it was part of a temporary structure, like like a shed building. You see a lot of shed extensions on some of these buildings. So was it temporary? Was it construction related? We don't know. But what's cool is that this will now be an exhibit, and visitors can pontificate on its phase of the construction and significance. So that's really cool. So like I said, Rucker Drug Store, the only one of the buildings that we know what it looked like because of a photograph, originally was part of that location before they moved it. And it was actually a building we looked for as well, but this is essentially what you'll see on top of Hertzberg buildings is a replica of the drugstore. Another wonderful thing we found was this quarter dollar. I don't remember the age of it, not sure. This was something we found at Hertzberg buildings. In fact, we've done a lot more information around it, so I'm kind of hoping to follow up on more of the artifactual findings. Oh, this medallion from a sewing machine was also something we located. This is a pocket knife constructed of bone and a very specific type of pottery, which the name of it is escaping my mind right now. Yeah, just a lot of unique things I think related to kind of the mercantile exchange that was going on at Hatfields. But there's more to talk about that in the future when we really finish processing all the artifacts. So definitely expect more information to come from these excavations. One of the last places I want to talk about was kind of for me, more exciting, the Bailey Gay and Hoxie store. Bailey Gay were named after 3 people that were part of the town. Bailey Gay, Edward Bailey, Thomas Gay, and Asa Hoxie. So this would have been similar to Hertzberg buildings, mercantile related. It was also a location for the Senate use during the 7th regular session. So more interesting events happened here. Lorraine and Jackson, interestingly, they uncovered some of this fireplace here I'm going to go into. They thought this was early construction. And there's a lot of reasons to determine it really wasn't. So here was kind of their finding. So they uncovered bits and pieces of it. We can see the H-shaped fireplace foundation, some brick rubble, maybe not piers, but you know, evidence of sidewalks and things. And this was very close to the Hertzberg building. And then this is kind of where we focused our investigations. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that geophysical inspection was met with a lot of difficulty, right? We had a lot of historic overprinting. So it was starting to look like most of the anomalies we were targeting weren't really terribly foundational. A lot of them were just artifactual deposits, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being able to find those and target those, because even the architectural debris, if it's not in situ, can tell you a lot about what that construction was at that time, even if you're just looking at nails, for example. So we hadn't really captured a lot of brick foundations through the magnetometer and EM data. So that led us to believe that maybe the bricks being fired nearby weren't being fired that strong or that hot. It's not unusual for bricks to not have a lot of magnetism. So if they're not finding magnetism, we are exhibiting a lot of magnetism. We thought we'd at least employ the GPR because the landscape was just nice enough to bring the GPR out and do some scanning. And it was dead on finding this H-shaped fireplace, which we hadn't quite georeferenced yet. And we threw some units down, and quickly we started finding handmade brick, and it turned into this gorgeous fireplace that Lorraine and Jackson had already uncovered. And then we found some more cool stuff in addition to this. So, you know, never in my career had I found a post mold that wasn't prehistoric, and never had I found a post mold that was square shaped. So I did find one before this. I mangled it a little bit, but on top of it, when we excavated it out, you know, you draw your little profile. There was wood in it. And I was like, that's first. So in addition to all that, we got to send a specialized sample out. I'm gonna have somebody analyze it. What is it? Is it oak? Is it cedar? Is it elm? And of course, it was cedar. And cedar was the most popular wood used, at least especially later construction. It just kind of became increasingly the wood that they chose, right? They did a lot of the bottomland stuff early on, those heavy oaks and elms, and then they moved on to just almost exclusively cedar. So cedar, brick. I think Lorraine and Jackson might have been a little bit off base about early construction, especially Michael's assumptions about kind of those phases of construction. Early Washington, right, from log cabins, stone masonry to heavily brick and frame buildings. It definitely represents a later period. So we still have quite a bit to unpack there about those phases of construction, but it's clearly pointing, the evidence is pointing towards this is very much the way it was being done. Just some brief acknowledgements and a little bit of a conclusion. Did have more archaeological work to do. There will always be more archaeological work to do at Washington-on-the-Brazos. I think we were able to answer some questions. There's certainly going to be more, which is typical with these kinds of investigations, especially when you've got such disparate records to work with and such palimpsests and erosion and just weird stuff going on. A lot of activity. So there will be more to say about this in the future. I hope we can have a TAS conference with a full symposium. It might be this year, it might be next, but I will invite more people to kind of explain their roles in the process, Michael, Jonathan, and hopefully we have more to talk about with the artifacts because there were over 200,000 recovered. A portion came back with us because we managed to leave the brick on site. Thank God. It was a lot of brick. So, and then some of it's going to conservation and it's going to be on display at the museum. But I just hope you guys really enjoyed learning about this project. It's just introductory. We'll have more to talk about in the future. What's cool about this project is that, I think the emphasis on the archaeology within the Living Museum is going to be just that icing on top because I think a lot of people in the public want to be involved in archaeology, right? That's why we have our societies, NTAS, HAS. So, instead of like turning on your TV to the like 100th disappointing episode of Oak Island, you can actually go drive up the road and see a real, excavation and an interpretation of that excavation. And it has a lot of meaning. Thanks goes out to just all the people who collaborated and participated. My team was excellent. These are archaeologists I've worked with for a long time. Some of them I just met, but we just vibed and we wanted to know more about the place. So thanks to my team and wherever you guys are. Some of you still work with me. Some of you are off to greater things and greater paths. Jonathan Failer on the top left is the park superintendent. He's still there today. He's just been such an advocate. He's raised money for this. He is the spokesman for Washington. He collaborated with us on understanding some of the artifacts that were very specific to Washington that maybe we were ignorant about. And so Jonathan's just this like wonderful plethora of knowledge, and a lot of it's all just self-taught. So he's just really cool. To his right is Sandy. Some of you guys know Sandy. She's a steward here from Huntsville, and she came out every week and she excavated with us. And well, she screamed a lot. And then she made us feel bad about how like inexperienced we are, but she was amazing. And we just loved having her. And I think she misses us as much as we miss her. Christopher, next to her, Christopher, our geophysicist, he's just been critical in this process and he's a joy to work with. And then Michael Moore on the top right, our historian, he really did drive a lot of this. But yeah, everyone else is those are just my team members and I just love them. And thank you for listening to our talk. And I really hope I can follow up with some more interesting finds from this project. So thanks for listening. Yeah, shoot, questions. You're right. The primary goal was to excavate horizontally and not focus too much vertically. When we went back this winter, we did a tiny bit more vertical exposure, so you'll see some of that when you go visit Hatfield's Exchange. But we didn't want to undermine the integrity. I think the instructions were like, just find the foundations, find how far they go, don't undercut them. You want to keep them kind of preserved. So it was that delicate balance, but we still found some mystery foundations or features, and one of them when we went back was probably a prehistoric thermal feature. So that was kind of exciting. Any other questions, or is that it? Does that help? Mostly horizontal, not a lot of vertical. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. That was very interesting, and hopefully some of us will get up there in due course. Okay. Very much, everybody. I think we're over now. I'd like to wish everyone a